broadcast.
So how many of these have you done already?
Tonight will be number 1.
This is number 1.
For me. For the group's been going on for how long, Joey?
Oh, couple of years. 3 years.
Yeah.
We took a break for about a year.
Yeah, there was a whole lot of nothing going on for a while, I remember, and then you got it going again. Yeah, Mike's helped to get us into the venue.
Well, thank Microsoft because they're doing it. So
They used to come to the .NET users group.
All right, so wonderfully shows up on the wrong screen. There we go. It was giving me a wonderful presentation, access expired, whatever that's supposed to mean in the context of a browser. All right, so talk a bit about advanced functions tonight. We'll run through some of the non-advanced features of them, the basic stuff that you can do with functions pretty quick as a sort of refresh, and get into the more advanced features, try to touch on best practice as we go through that. Things that will just make your life a little bit easier, make the lives of people who are touching your functions a little bit easier. So without further ado, functions are, if you're not aware, they're a grouping of PowerShell statements that encapsulate a particular task. So when you're approaching problems that you're going to solve with your scripts, you're going to break them down into smaller and smaller steps, smaller and smaller pieces. It's a process called functional decomposition. You just want to break it down into the smallest steps that you can, and then you wrap each of those tiny steps into a function. It will make it easier for you to manage that process, that complex task, work through it, makes it easier for you to maintain, update, debug your code, makes your scripts easier to read and follow. So, drop that guy over there. There we go. So I don't have a bunch of fancy VMs on here like some people do for showing these things, but kind of hacked together a rudimentary way to get this going with just a bunch of cleverly hidden hash tables. So got a pretty basic function here. Get demo computer info. It takes a single parameter, computer name, and I'm wrapping that around a get demo sys info. All that does is it spits out a bunch of hash tables, more or less, as objects to simulate hitting a real computer. And then we're filtering that on name like computer name. So to get a quick look at how that works. And we got 4 different servers in there. Names, domain, RAM, OS, IP address. And if we hit our computer name parameter, let's pick on DB server 1. update the file and .source it back in again. There we go. So we specify a single parameter, single argument to our parameter, and we get back a single server. We can, optionally here, as I get lost already. Names. Yep. If we want to work with multiple of these, because specifying a single one at a time isn't terribly helpful for us. We can create a little loop. Save that, re-import that. Still works for getting one. We can specify a second one now. And make sure you update the variable inside of your loop. And that's how we can take an array of inputs, cycle through that, and get input.
Do you find that for each is pretty easy just to wrap whatever code you have, or you have to worry about other problems with multiples versus a single as you're developing code? I'm just curious.
I don't really run into any issues with it. It's kind of a circumstantial on really what kind of loop you want to use. Generally, a for each loop is generally going to be the fastest one that you can use because pipelines have processing overhead to them. So if you start using a bunch of for each objects, you're going to notice that your script gets pretty slow. But yeah, as long as you can keep track of your sentinel value in your loop, then yeah, no problems. They work pretty good in these cases when you want to be able to take an array and through command line binding, which is what you're doing when you specify on the command line like we are on the left, your function name followed by your parameter name followed by an array. When you're taking an input that way, you really want to use for each loop inside of your function.
Yeah, I've only run into this once or twice as I was building a function. I'm like, oh, just wrap to a for each. I'm like, I wonder if there's other caveats of, you have to, what else you have to do with your code as you're worrying about that. With multiples versus singles, right? Singles are easy.
Yeah, and the nice thing about this is even if you specify a single, the variable is getting populated with one value, it's going to loop through once. Yeah, it really makes no difference to you.
Right.
But it nicely handles an array as well. So it's kind of generally the direction that you want to go with that if you're taking in multiple for one parameter. This thing's on, by the way.
Yeah, I run into students that they're like, well, I piped one object in and it worked, and then I piped in 5 and only the last one showed up. Right? Because you didn't put it in a for each. And they're like, what?
Well, if you're piping in, you probably don't want to use a for each, because a for each isn't going to work with pipeline input. But we'll get to that part where it kind of explains how you need to code for both. So we can take in multiple values that way. Another practice that's good to get into is type constraining your variables. And you do that by jumping into your parameter block up there. Give it a couple of square brackets right on top of your parameter name, and give it a type name. String seems to work pretty good for a computer name. I can't imagine taking an integer for that, so we'll run with that. Alternatively, you can stick your type on the same line as your parameter name. Nothing wrong with that. Personally, I like to go vertical because as you start tacking in more stuff into that parameter block, it's going to start getting longer and longer and longer. And do you want to scroll really far to the right, or would you rather just scroll down where it's easier to read? To me, it's just easier to do it this way. And good to keep in mind that with PowerShell's behavior for trying to kind of implicitly coerce data types around, this ends up behaving sort of like a poor man's input validation. If whatever value you try to throw into computer name, PowerShell is going to try to convert it into a string. And that works great for integers. They can go back and forth on that fairly easily all day. But if someone were to throw in a hash table or an array, it'll fail. And instead of failing somewhere deep into your function where you need to start debugging why it failed at that particular spot, it'll fail at binding right there. So quick way to demonstrate that, let's just say the computer name needs to take a hash table. Reload that in. And if we try to pass in our array again, we get a wonderfully informative message that says that we cannot transform the parameter from a object to a hash table. Likewise, if we dock this down to a single one, it'll say that we can't convert a string into a hash table. And then nothing else inside of your function is going to run. So it saves you a little debugging there. But you'll notice that if we try to run and query for two systems again, we're not getting any output now. Any idea what happened there? Yeah, we're trying to pass an array, but we type constrained it to a single string. So in order to fix that, we want to come up here, add 2 more square brackets. That pretty much says that we can now take an array of strings. Whee! I tell you, the way that this automatically sets up the extended monitor, my mouse is over here. I can't go anywhere to the next screen, so I have to bring it all the way back down here to the corner, like it. Kind of irritating. So,
You're on a Mac machine.
Mac? I don't get paid that much money. So, ideally, to start getting into the nicer features, we need to make it advanced. How do we make a function advanced? You got 2 ways to do it. You can add a commandlet binding attribute right up at the top of your function body. Or, optionally, you can add the parameter attribute to any of the parameters that you're working with, and that will also bump it up to an advanced function. But best practice is just throw the commandlet binding attribute up in there. It's quicker and easier to see it. Someone doesn't have to dig down into your parameter block to find out if it's there. So what we would do is we'd come right up here. And we're binding. Now before I refresh that in my shell over here, let's do a quick git command or a git demo. Use the syntax parameter to pull up the syntax of the command. And we can see it's pretty simple. An optional computer name that takes a string of arrays. Update that in the session, run it again. Now we've got this common parameters. The common parameters are pretty closely related to a lot of the preference variables that are in your session. And to get a look at those, if you're not familiar with them, do a get variable and a asterisk preference on the wildcard. And we get all of these fun guys. Confirm preference, debug preference, error action, information, progress verbose, warning, blah, 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 blah. And they all have these default values on them. Essentially, getting the default parameters means that we get access to a whole bunch of new switches on our function that don't even necessarily need to be, they're not explicitly documented in the function. They're just there. PowerShell provides the framework for you to get to them. And by specifying any of those, we can start to override these default preference values so that certain output streams behave differently than they're set to by default. And if you've messed around with other shells, you're probably definitely familiar with standard error, standard out, two main output streams that you usually get. PowerShell has 6 altogether. You got your standard out, error, warning, verbose, debug, and information. Forgetting one? That was 6, right?
Yep.
Good. I've had enough coffee today. I don't think I can count.
There's a new one, the right information, which apparently they may deprecate.
Already? They just
Yeah.
brought it in version 5.
This came out in version 5, but I first chatted they may deprecate it. But then they re-engineered it that right host uses right information.
Yeah, I've heard that right host is now a wrapper for right information because right host before version 5 was the handiwork of Satan.
Right.
Now apparently it's good. I don't know.
Well, now it has values, right? So I can silently continue it, and I can suppress it, and I can write to error logs because it's now part of another stream.
Yeah, it's part of the information stream.
Right.
And along with that, each of these preference variables, when you start getting into the parameters on these that go with the function, rather, make sure I'm updated on that. Quick way to look at the list of them. Start tab completing on this. We got our computer name, verbose, debug, error action, warning action. These action parameters tie to the preference variables up above there. And those allow us to override those actions when we override those preferences when we have a whatever action parameter. The verbose and the debug don't have a corresponding action parameter. They just have a default behavior that they're going to give you whether you like it or not. If you want to override that, you'd have to do it specifically inside the body of your function. But you also get error variable, warning variable, information variable. So instead of piping those output streams to your shell, you can just send those out to a variable for logging, auditing, whatever. You got a client, someone in another department that says they're having issues with something. You know, all right, John, I've got a bunch of right errors in there. Why don't you go ahead and put error variable to this, output it to a file, you know, let me see what's in there. Out variable if you want to send your standard out somewhere else. So since there's a lot of those, instead of trying to stick everything right over in there, bless you.
Thank you.
Look at this guy just for the sake of seeing the different streams you got to work with. So this function will write output, it'll write to error, it'll write to warning, verbose, debug, and information. Got to make sure you get your commandlet binding in there, otherwise none of these will work. You can specify them if you want to, but the switches for using them in the common parameters will be gone. Bounce over here to our shell. Just stick that right in there. And we'll just send a single message through, and automatically we will get the first line that we get here is coming from our write output over here. Then we get an error using our same message from our write error commandlet there. We also have a warning in nice big yellow letters coming from our write warning. And you may notice that the write error, we spit that out, but we kept going down to the warning and where we spit out the value of this variable A, 4. Write error by default does not give terminating errors. So it's kind of fuzzy where you would want to use this as opposed to a try catch. But if for some reason you want to use, if you want to spit out some errors that are non-terminating, but you just want to either capture it in a variable or a file, or you just want the user to be aware of it, you have that option.
So I have to ask, does anybody ever use write error? I mean, it's spitting out all that red in the end user. They're just going to ignore that and give you a call saying, why'd you write that code? Even though it says, call Joey at this phone number at line 1, character 1, line, find out which streams, message error. Oh,
I'll use write error inside of like a catch,
okay.
so I can format my error.
Right.
Or maybe I want to catch something but not have it be terminated. So that's how I can catch what would otherwise be a terminating error. And then terminate on it.
Although I don't use writing error, I sometimes prefer the gobbledygook as far as for my own personal development. Would be if get something explained out, particularly like say a good example would be like primary connection out where and PowerShell actually gives you the breakdown why it's not connected, not just the fact that it's not connected.
Right.
And so then the gobbledygook comes in handy when you're trying to work out the problems within a short script.
Someone else raised their hand right here.
Joey got mine reading formatting and controlling how you terminate.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it returns an error object, right?
Yeah, it'll return an error object. You can actually,
If you're not catching an error, but you want to throw something in your module or whatever, you can do that.
errors, yeah,
so
error, there
I'm
we go.
going to use right there. I'll use dollar underscore exception get that. Or
Right.
exception dot message.
Got message, yeah.
And yeah, it spits this out into the error automatic variable. So pick the first index on that, and there's the right error that we just did. So you probably also noticed, though, write verbose did not give us any output. Write debug gave us no output, and write information gave us no output. These you have to specifically say you want something from them. And there's a different way to do that for all of them. Well, verbose and debug, you do it the same way, but you get two different types of behavior. Information, you have to do it a slightly different way. So verbose is easy enough. You just give it the verbose switch. And then inside your function body, any verbose, any write verbose commandlets, you'll get their output now, like that. And a nice thing about a lot of this is if you have, if you're nesting more functions and more commandlets inside, any of the common parameters that you specify at your calling level will automatically inherit down to anything that supports common parameters. So if you got call another function, which calls another function, which calls another function, and they all support common parameters, they all have write verbose in them, your verbose switch will go down to all of them. So you don't have to go through the code and specify it on every single one. Pretty handy. Really handy thing about verbose also is a lot of people like to use write host as sort of like a progress indicator going through their functions. You know, write host, I got X value in this parameter. Write host, now I'm doing this. Write host, I'm at this position in the loop. Write host, I'm done. Granted, write host is supposed to be wrapping write information now, so it's not supposed to be as evil as it used to be, but it's still not good practice to use it in that way. Generally, it's still only good to use it when you need colored CLI GUI output, pretty much. Like if you're writing a CLI menu, then write host is pretty awesome. Otherwise, you really want to use verbose, because part of the mentality behind advanced functions is that you're trying to closely approximate the behavior of compiled commandlets, right? And compiled commandlets don't give you a lot of wordy information unless you specifically ask for it. You tell it to get something, it gets you something. Or you get a message saying, yeah, I couldn't get that, here's an error. If you tell it to set, it sets it, and it, excuse me, it'll set it, and it won't give you any information about that unless you ask it for information. They're quiet most of the time. And if you're using write host to spit out a bunch of information, you're not really giving whoever your user is the option of seeing that information. You're just saying, here it is, take it or leave it. If you put your information into write verbose and someone wants to see that information, they can specify the verbose switch. If they don't want it, they can leave the switch off and they don't need to see any of it. So it's really just kind of a quality of life thing for yourself, the maintainer, and the people who are going to be using your functions.
I was in San Antonio, and this engineer wrote write host everywhere. And before he rolled it into production, he remmed them all out. He didn't want the end user to see him.
Did he actually do rem and PowerShell?
Well, he commented out, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but he didn't know write verbose and making an advanced function. I'm like, well, do this. He's like, oh my gosh. So every write host that he didn't want presented to the end user, he had to go through and find the itch code, you know, and then undo it for himself and redo it. I'm like, okay. But he didn't know, right? There's too much in the world to know.
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing to know that.
Exactly.
If you want the verbose output, just say verbose. If not, yeah, forget it. So debug is a bit of a weird case. The default behavior on debug is silently continue. So that's why by default you don't see anything from write debug. But as soon as you specify it, you get this weirdness. So we're stopping right here on line 83. Excuse me. And this message here is telling us that the behavior of debug is now set to inquire. The inquire action gives you this prompt that you see right here. Do you want to continue? Do you want to hold the command? Would you like to suspend it? And suspend is really the only interesting one of these. S, suspend, we're back to a prompt. If you're using a normal prompt that's not customized like mine, then you'll get 2 greater than signs on your prompt specifying that you are in a child session within the scope of your function. So from inside of here, we got access to things like the PS commandlet variable. We have access to that A variable that was specified before. And you can change it. And if you're working in VS Code, you definitely have a far superior debugger available to you. So there's really no reason to use this. In fact, if you try to run this in the integrated terminal in VS Code, if you try to do a debug and drop down into the child session, it'll break. It does not work. You have to actually close VS Code to break out of it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm running it in a shell here off to the side. So don't do it in there. Use the built-in debugger. But if you're in a situation where maybe you have a remote session up to a box, you need to debug some scripts that are running on there that you don't have available locally, and you're just stuck in the shell, this is an option that you could use there. Throw some write debugs in there. See what kind of output you get. Drop into the interactive session. To drop out of it, hit exit. You come back to a prompt. Say, yes, we want to continue with everything. And then the A variable that we updated from 4 to 5 spits out 5. So you can actually change stuff in there and then continue with execution. Information. You only got 2 options, action and variable. Action by default is silently continue. So if you want to get any output from your write information commandlets, you need to specify information action continue. And then you see the message that we passed in, a little world, shows up down here now after we spit out A. And you can redirect those to variables. You can redirect those to, I believe, files. And you can do some weird, like that, the redirect operator. It's things like, I can't remember the exact syntax. I didn't look it up for this, but Is it 3 at greater than? That doesn't look right. Ampersand. That's an ampersand.
Right.
Yeah, you can redirect the streams out to files, whatever else you want to, just like and I'm pretty sure you could do it in the old command shell. You could do it the same thing in Bash, any of the Linux shells. The bad part about that is you need to know which one are numbered. I think standard output is 1, errors 2, I think.
You have them in order. Yeah. So
They're in the correct order there? Okay. Okay, so yeah, 3 would then go to warning.
And then information is actually streamed.
Yeah. And that's pretty much saying take the stream of this number and spit it out over to this. So. I'm going to take you back over here. All right, going back over to our demo computer info function. Let's say, hypothetically, we don't want people to be able to run this without specifying a parameter. So we can make it mandatory, and to do that, we specify our parameter attribute, and right inside we stick mandatory. These act, I know they show up as the autocomplete on here, it shows up as a Boolean. They act more like switches, I think, because by default, it's false by not specifying it. As soon as you stick it in there, it's considered true. So what you'll see in a lot of scripts is people will say mandatory equal true, which is perfectly fine. It's very explicit, but you don't have to do that. If you want to keep it short and sweet, mandatory is just fine. And older ones? Okay. I think that makes more sense. Mandatory equal true is just a little too verbose for my taste, but what you definitely don't want to do, which I see surprisingly often, is don't say mandatory equals false. If it's going to be false, why have it in there to begin with? Just take it out. But we can say mandatory. And if you try to run this, I'm not going to scroll back up through all that. It's going to prompt you. It's going to say, hey, you need to give me something for this computer name parameter. We can give it something. It'll ask again if we want some more, because we have said that we're taking possibly an array here. So you can keep specifying values all day long. But hit enter again out of blank, fills it out, and get your results. If you want to be a little helpful to people, you can specify a help message. And this only works in context of having mandatory. Yeah, it's a little wordy, right? Yeah. Computer name, yeah. But sometimes you might want to add a clarifying. Beg your pardon? Learn something new every day, right?
Show them how it works. And this is where I question the person that's trying to get to PowerShell. Are they usually going to read this, or are they going to just call you up and say, what'd you write that code for?
Right. So the new part that you get is down here. Type exclamation question for help. And the help that you get is the help that you wrote.
So in GitHub?
In GitHub?
GitHub.
Oh, get help?
GitHub function name?
You know what? I don't think it does.
It does not.
Yeah.
So I absolutely love this feature, and I don't know if anybody's ever going to use it, because get help, if you don't know what's going on, you do a get help and you've written some get help syntax and it shows you, oh, example 1, example 2, and you should have, like a good steward of your code, put in some examples.
Yeah.
This one is very cryptic. You're like, Bang question mark for what is that? And so I absolutely love this feature and I think everybody should use it, but I don't know if anybody's actually, other than a PowerShell person.
I don't know that I've gone specifically looking for cases where it is properly used.
Right.
Because going for that help message on a parameter is generally not the first place I go to find out what I'm supposed to be putting in there.
You do get help.
Yeah, I do get help or get command syntax,
Right.
any of those really.
It just doesn't show up there.
Did you pass Bing question mark to the parameter on prompt? Or will it take Bing parameter as, in this case?
Yeah, and then what happens if you actually have a computer name that?
Exactly. You should.
So for next month's meeting, we need to find out, will AD take this for a computer name?
Now,
No,
I don't know if you're going to go on to something else, but mandatory, right? So computer name, it's good stewardship to give it a local host or give it a value, right?
Yeah, it is actually, from the way that a lot of commandlets behave, I'd say that in this case, it's good stewardship, to use your work term, to not make it mandatory, and instead give it a default value. Like that. And it's good to note that mandatory and a default value cannot go together. And when you think about it, they totally conflict with each other. Because if you're going to make a parameter mandatory, why does it have a default value to fall back to if nothing is specified as a value? Doesn't make any sense.
And that's what annoys me is that I want a local host or something in there like environment variable computer name like that, but I need a mandatory, and then it negates it. You know, like,
Yeah.
so then you should, like you said, you shouldn't define it, but you're supposed to.
Well, it's kind of by putting a default value there, you're pretty much saying that this is going to get populated no matter what.
Right.
So mandatory is like saying mandatory user input. Is probably a better way to look at it rather than a mandatory parameter to be used.
Right. That's a good way of thinking of it.
So update that, run that with nothing, and we get the local system returned out of that little list. Another handy one that you can look at in here is you want to set up a position on these if you don't want to specify a parameter name every single time you want to run this. So by default, all parameters in PowerShell are positional. By default, you don't have to actually, unless explicitly built somewhere into the commandlet or the function, you don't need to give names for any parameters. You just need to supply arguments in the correct order that parameters are built into the parameter block. Let's say something like age, just for grins. Since everything is positional by default, as soon as you specify explicitly a position for a parameter, that parameter is now still positional in the position you've defined it in. Everything that does not have a position defined is now a named parameter. You have to name them. They're no longer positional. So we don't need to say computer name anymore. We can just say DB server 1. We can get our output. But if we try to throw something in at that age parameter, it's not going to like that because it can't find anything to bind that integer to. If we come in here, give this guy a position real quick, like that. Now it works. Yay! Even though we're not doing anything with that, doesn't matter. but gives you an idea of how the position attribute can start to work. Take this whole guy out of here because we're not using that. Now, looking stuff up by computer name in this set of data is fine and good, but what if we want to look it up by other things, right? We're pulling out a domain, we're pulling out RAM, the OS, IP address, and you can really just kind of use your imagination for any number of things that you might want to look for alternatively. We can start to specify some additional parameters. Probably makes sense to stick to strings for most of these. Same domain. And these get comma delimited as you start putting them in. Let's make this a little bit quicker. Address. So at that point, we could specify any number of these, but we're not doing anything with them. But when you start thinking about it, does it make any sense to specify any combination of those together? And it kind of depends on how you want to use your function, how you want to look stuff up. But generally, if you're looking for multiple values, filtering on multiple values, you're going to have probably a filter parameter. And you'll build something in to pass a filter in. But if we're looking for just a domain, just a particular amount of RAM, whatever, maybe what we want to do is start putting stuff into parameter sets. And you can do that with the parameter set name attribute equals, give it a name. Let's stick another one of these up here. These get comma delimited too, just like the rest of them. Now, if you remember back to one of the last Git commands that we did on the syntax, I remember that we saw just a single line of output specifying the computer name parameter along with the data type that it would take. Once you start using parameter sets, you're going to get a line for every single parameter set that you specify, because it's essentially a set of parameters that can only be used within that set. You can't start mixing and matching outside of the parameter set. So you're going to get one for computer name, domain, RAM, whatever else. Common parameters are still available to everything. You can use those wherever you want. But this is a way of explicitly laying out your function to very more tightly control exactly what you can bring in and work with.
So say you want to pass in only the IP address, similar to your NS lookup. How would you pass that on your command line?
You want to just look up by the IP address. You can just hit the IP address, since it's really just strings inside of there right now. You can do something like this, but if you try to go in and specify other parameters, there's nothing else outside of the common parameters. you can't get to any of the other ones that are specified in your script block. If we want to actually start pulling that information out, we need to code in a case for that. And here, actually handling just that. And a good way to do that is a switch. One of the nice bells and whistles that you get with advanced functions is you get this automatic PS commandlet variable that exists inside your function. And one of the attributes on it is the parameter set name. So we can use a parameter set name on a switch to figure out which one of these was specified. You could do a just more or less a complex if then else on whether or not particular variables have something inside of them. But you're kind of reinventing the wheel at that point. By going up to an advanced function, this is one of the nice things that you get to help you along through decisions like this. So it makes more sense to just go ahead and use that.
You can also include different parameters in multiple routers.
Yeah, you can have.
Like OS, not as own router set. It could be in IP and RAM domain.
Yeah, one example that I think I was looking at a while back, I was helping a guy out with, was he was writing a script that would work against his database server. And he wanted one parameter set for, I want to run this on every database on my server. Or if I specify the database and the server, I want it to run only on that database. And what you can do in that case is have one parameter set that has only the server parameter and another parameter set that has the server and the database. And then you would just set your default parameter set to the one for the server. And then he could very easily split those two workflows that way. But yeah, you can throw as many parameters as you want into a set. The only requirement is that every set needs to have one unique parameter that's not in any other set. Otherwise, it starts to run into issues resolving which parameter set you're trying to use.
My example is always new-contoso user or new-contoso object. Sorry, new-contoso object. And it could be user or computer. So you get a spreadsheet of first name, last name, department, cost center, and so forth. And you can use some of those columns on new-contoso object, whereas first name, last name wouldn't be used with computer objects, but maybe the cost center is used for both.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I like your database example too. Because yeah, you basically throw a switch in there and say, all right, it's this, and give me all the stuff. And you can see where 80% of the code is the same, and instead of having two separate functions that you have to manage, you're just dealing with 10 lines of code that are different in the same function.
Yeah, and there's definitely a conversation to be had around whether or not your function is kind of breaking the rules of a function by doing that, because generally good practice is your function needs to do one thing and do it really well.
Right.
If you start getting into parameter sets, they're useful, but you're almost begging the question of, do I really need to have one function for this, or would it be better to split it up into two? You probably find a good argument for either side of that, but it's going to come down to your use case.
Well, especially if 60% of the code is the same in both functions.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're editing both functions and you make one change, you're like, oh, I gotta go fix the other one, as opposed to combining them up. And then you're, like you said, use case for both situations.
Yeah. But if you're going to start using parameter sets, it's good practice to come up to your commandlet binding attribute and add the default parameter set name up here that you want to fall back to.
Isn't that a requirement?
It is not a requirement, but it's good practice. And generally, I'm pretty sure this would fail if we try to specify a positional computer name without the parameter name. It would probably fail if you don't have this up here.
Yeah, one supersedes the other one. One's ignored if you put it in command binding.
Yeah. So we can just say, yeah, pass in a string, and it's going to automatically assume that we're going to this guy. More than likely do the position. Let's take the position out real quick, actually. Just for grants. So we got to have that position in there. That's right, because it's named.
And just side chat with this position, I see several people code, they write position equals 0 like 3 or 4 times.
You can do that if you have them broken up into different parameter sets.
No, it's one parameter.
Yeah, that gets a little confusing then.
Yeah,
I don't think that would work.
Why? And I assumed someone copied and pasted code and didn't know what it meant. But my position equals 0, I better leave it because I copied and pasted someone's code. Is my assumption.
Could be.
I'm like, but how did? So my question is, if you're missing that, which one wins? They're all 0.
My guess would be that would be a conflict that doesn't have some way of determining what it is. I mean, well, you could probably swing that if everything with a position 0 has a different type constraint. So if one's a string, the other one's a hash table. Well, integer and string can sometimes be interchangeable because it can convert them pretty easily. But if you have clearly defined type constraints that can't be converted back and forth and all of them set to position 0, that might work. Maybe. I wouldn't want to. I mean, try it for the sake of academic interest, but I wouldn't do that in a production environment.
I'm just curious if anybody else has seen that other than parameters.
Yeah, not something I would try.
Yeah.
So what would be really nice, because probably the nicest feature of built-in commandlets is pipeline support. If we could add pipeline support to this, because it works pretty good with command line binding over here, but I'd really like to be able to take a list of systems out of a CSV or a text file or just specify them, pipe them directly into that. Do that. Let's go ahead and collapse this guy for now. Oh, we did not finish writing that up. Let's do that real quick. Computer name.
Nice they put a default value in.
Yeah, that's one of the built-in snippets in VS Code.
How do you get to that? What's the shortcut?
Usually you can just start typing it and your IntelliSense will pop up and switch statement snippet. You hit that and it'll spit the skeletal framework of it into there. And it'll do that with most of the constructs. You can also optionally create your own and get those in there. But last I checked, I believe, I could be wrong because it's been a while, but I believe you can't remove the default snippets or overwrite them. So that's kind of a pain.
Even in the JSON user file.
Yeah, I don't think you can do that. It's actually a separate place that you do them in. Its own snippets file. This part gets a little tedious, but it's just an example of how you can split these up into different parameter sets and then start changing what output you're going to grab based on the example that we're working with. Save that. Push that back in there. And IP address works now when I pull out a web server. So where we were about to pivot to for pipeline, you need to have a process block. There are 3 blocks altogether, but the only one that you really need for the pipeline is process at a minimum. The other 2 are optional, circumstantially useful, but this is the one you really want.
What are the other two?
The other 2 are begin and end. So
Usually, if you don't use them, you put the link.
usually if I'm not going to use them, I just don't put them in.
Because I feel like I have functions that will be-
Yeah, and you can have that there just for the sake of whatever. Maybe you got a template that you work off of and you just like to have that in there for the sake of being verbose about it. But it's not required. You can take those out.
They automatically break it. If you want to code it.
Do they break in debug mode? Okay. The
Register, process, and start that process.
different. Process is, everything in process is going to run one time for every item in the pipeline. So if you pass in 5 things, everything in the process block will run 5 times.
Start process from a single one.
Yeah, start process is a commandlet for starting a process on your system. And yeah, that'll run one time. I think it'll take an array of stuff though. Contrast process with begin and end. It's sidestepping a little bit into how pipelines work, but as soon as you stick that pipe character into anything that you're running, really, starts doing some extra stuff under the hood as soon as you execute that. So boom, right there, automatically tells PowerShell that it's going to spin up everything that it needs under the hood for building a pipeline. And part of that is it looks at every function in the pipeline ahead of time, and it executes every single begin block at the beginning before anything has been bound to any parameters. So some people will, you got all your stuff up here in your parameter block, and some people will want to reference that in their begin, and they get really confused when they can't. And it's because begin block runs before parameter binding. So you literally can't reference anything out in your parameters in there. What it's good for is setting up the environment that's going to be used repeatedly by things that are in your process block, such as if you write a function that's going to be hitting a database multiple times, and it's maybe a different query or parameterized queries in the process block, you want to establish your connection to the database once instead of building it up and tearing it down every time. So you can build it in your begin block, and then you can use that connection in the process block. And then at the end of the pipeline, when everything has been processed through, PowerShell will go through and it'll run every end block in order. And then you can tear down your connection in there. It would be one hypothetical scenario where you might want to use that. Or maybe you just want to throw something at the end of it that says, hey, I finished processing in the pipeline. Do a get date, store it in a variable to start a clock, do it at the end to see how long pipeline processing took for just that function.
Or in the begin block, you can say, now starting process, and please wait until it completes, and it could take an hour. So what's going to happen after 7 minutes? People are going to go, is it running? Is it running?
Yeah.
And in your end block, you can say, now disconnect from server, process complete, file here, like you mentioned.
And that's another good case to use write verbose.
Right.
Yeah. If it's going to be a long running process, tell people to run it with the verbose, and you got something that will give you progress in there. But those are optional. You don't need to have them if you don't need to use them for anything. Or you can just stick them in there and they won't do any harm. But before you can start taking any input, you got to add some additional stuff up in your parameter block. Generally, I would think that it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't make any sense to take domain, RAM, OS, IP address, things like that as input unless the commandlet is, or unless the function is specifically doing something related to, take IP addresses in, and because it's going to do something specific to network interfaces, would make more sense. But in this case, computer name makes sense to take pipeline input on. To do that, we add another attribute in here. We say value from pipeline. Save that. Erase that. Reload that. Now, server 1, server 1. We can take those in just like that without ever having to specify a parameter. The alternative to that, I think Joey mentioned earlier this evening that he gets tripped up by occasionally, is value from pipeline by property name. There's a subtle but probably big difference between the two of these and how they behave. Value from pipeline means that that parameter is going to consume the entire object from the pipeline. Doesn't matter if it's a string, doesn't matter if it's a PS custom object, doesn't matter if it's a hash table, whatever it is, it's going to take the whole thing, and it's going to try to work with that. Value from pipeline by property name implies, one, that we're passing in an object of whatever sort, and it's going to try to take a property name off of that object matching the name of the parameter. So set up a little custom object here, and we're going to give it a name property. And we're going to try to pipe that into, make sure I've reloaded this first. Input object cannot be bound to any parameters. That's because it can't find a match between the name equal logos to the computer name parameter that we're building this onto. If we change this to computer name, it works because we have a matching parameter name or matching property name. Now, sometimes, usually if, especially like in the AD module, commandlets in there are pretty good about, commandlets and objects are pretty good about using names and parameter names that line up pretty nicely. There are scenarios where that's not always going to work out. You might be taking output from, one module, perhaps for VMware, and it's going to be spitting out its version of what it thinks a VM object should look like. And if you're trying to pass that into something else that doesn't agree with those property names, you can have a bad time. There are two ways that you can try to get around that. One is you can pipe through a select object and do a calculated property to convert it into something friendlier for your input function, or in the function that you're writing, you can specify alias on that parameter, and you can give a new alias name of name. Now, computer name still works on an input object. Name also works because we've told it, hey, you can look for computer name, that's your default, but you can also look for name, that's an alias. An added bonus of that is you can't tab find it, you can't tab complete to find it, but we can now use name for command line binding also. So you're pretty much just specifying additional names that parameter will go by now. Yeah.
The tags won't show you the names there.
Not if you're trying to tab complete for the name, it won't. It's more of an internal, specific to the function to use to help it bind a little more friendly-like to other objects that might be coming in through the pipeline.
my example is you get this Excel spreadsheet, that's computer name, right? And then the purchasing agent comes along and changes that value to name,
Yeah.
PC, or device. And all of a sudden you have to go through your code and look for $sign computer name and change it all the way through your code. Just throw an alias at the top, it's done.
Yep.
Right? Because we don't have computers anymore, we have devices. And we don't have devices anymore, we have laptops. Or it's a CPU, right? So the alias, I absolutely love that feature too, because I know people are like, I had to go through 500 lines of code and find $sign computer name and re-variable it because someone changed the name. No, just throw an alias at the top, done.
Quick and easy.
Quick and easy.
So we're going to tell that, put that out, looking at the code to see if it's by property name or just value for property item.
Yes.
It's in syntax. It's under full also.
Yeah, I was debating. I thought there was something else. Yeah, full. So if you do a full, get help on that. Under the parameters section, yeah, all of this stuff is dynamically created off of the metadata that you specify inside your parameter block. So you don't explicitly, like through comment-based help, you don't specify any of this stuff. So computer name, accept pipeline input, true by property name. You can see that in there. There is a, I think there is a series of commands you can put together. It's like get help and then dot notating on the parameters property and kind of digging in to find like all the functions and commandlets on your system that will accept by property name input like that. There's a way to do that. I can't remember it off the top of my head.
We go here, run on 5.1 or 6.
Over here on the right,
Yep.
5.1. I've recently been running into issues with getting 6 to run in VS Code. It just times out and fails after 5 minutes, and nobody knows why. You too? Yeah. Kind of irritating. It's absolutely nothing in the logs, nothing in the verbose debugging.
If you change the line ending, it'll
Freaks out.
you know, you do it a few times, it eventually will work. But then you don't quite know what state it's really in.
Just so everybody knows, Windows PowerShell is 5.1. PowerShell Core is 6.
It's actually up to 6.1.1 now, I think.
And yeah, 6.2 is supposed to be released in March or February.
Yeah.
That was
Downloaded 6.12 tonight.
Oh, they're up to 6.1.2 now. Okay. Yeah, and kind of a probably a nice to know on that if you do ever use write debug is, I don't know if it's in that version that you just downloaded, but there was a PR merged in December, I think, or the month before. They are changing that behavior now because they decided that inquire is not good behavior for write debug. They decided that continue is the proper behavior for debug. So now it'll behave exactly like write verbose.
So if I'm staying with 5.1, versus
Yeah.
6 is looking at the future.
Yeah, depending on your environment.
Yeah.
Pretty much everything that I'm still doing, any of the billable work that I'm doing, it's all 5.1 because most of our clients, if you tell them to go download and install core, that'd be, they'll get back to you in a year when change management finally gets around to it.
Has there been any enterprise acceptance toward 6 yet?
Yeah, you're heterogeneous. So that's the problem. So we have, like 2,300 built-in commandlets on Windows PowerShell. We're up to 300 built-in commandlets on PowerShell Core. It really should be PowerShell Core 1.0. They really screwed up.
Yeah, I'm not sure what was going on with
Windows
the.
PowerShell on .NET Core, not .NET Windows. So, and that's why they're decoupling everything, and dash computer name parameters are now removed because that didn't follow the proper process to go through remoting, and they have to decouple all the dependencies, right? You guys can see, if I can't call a WMI object on Windows OS, what am I supposed to do? And I have to re-engineer how the .NET works with Ubuntu and Red Hat and Mac and all that other stuff. So I can see the problems, but at the same time, Windows PowerShell is very robust, and it really feels like we're going backwards to a degree.
There are some cases where they've made improvements to it too. It's
Right.
kind of circumstantial. If you're still very much in the I'm managing Windows systems and Windows servers world, you're probably better off sticking to Windows PowerShell.
Oh, yeah.
If you're in the cloud, you probably safely go over Core. I think there's only a handful, like the new Azure AD module might work in Core. I haven't tried it, but I think the older MS Online module didn't work very good. I think it errored out if you tried to use it. Exchange Online probably works because that's a remote. I'm sure the new AZ Azure module probably works just fine too.
It'd be derailed.
Yeah, no worries.
These compatibility packing.
I have not.
I tried it when it first came out and it just posed, like it just didn't fail.
Yeah, I remember.
Boring, and then
I remember when it first came out, and a lot of the Core guys were tweeting about it and talking about it. Like, this is great. You can use all these, all the Windows PowerShell stuff in Core now. And you just got to do this, long line of commands to get it working. I think it's included. Yeah, I think it's included in Core. Yeah, but yeah, most of our clients aren't even anywhere near that, so I haven't had much excuse to go playing with it just yet. So, fun thing that you can look at this point, bring this over because I'm not going to rewrite all these. Input validation. And the functions give you a lot of input validation attributes that you can use that do great and wonderful things for you. So if you need to validate, say, a phone number, you can use the validate pattern attribute with a regex that you obviously figured out entirely on your own because you all know regex. And then we can try to set phone number on a phone number. And because I am so awesome at regex, this will take. Oh, I can't remember which one it's going to take now. Yeah, you're right. I need to wrap this in strings. So it doesn't error out. It works. And if I recall, this one in particular works with all manner of formats for these. Yeah. Doesn't like that one. It's got to have stuff in the middle of it, I guess. 2, 3, 4.
Would something like that be allowed on basically like international standards of
I think this particular regex would, but if you can write a regex that'll handle that case, then it'll work because the validate pattern attribute is just running a regex, and if it comes back true, it'll bind the parameter. If it comes back false, it'll fail spectacularly, like you saw there.
So here's my question around this, whenever I get to this topic. Validate pattern, if you run this against an array, the whole thing fails, just dies. If the parameter's loaded first before it'll go into your code.
Does it do that?
Yeah.
Even if you tell it to take an array of whatever?
Yeah. So it'll go through the entire array. So say there's 30 phone numbers you have to input,
Mm-hmm.
and one of them's wrong. Die.
Okay, but it will run through them.
It'll run through all 3 of them, but the error throws red before your script runs. So it'll go up, check all the parameters and say, did you match this? One of them out of 30 fails, and so I'll fail the whole thing.
Interesting.
So picture yourself getting 30 new phone numbers or 30 new employees. You want 29 to work. So if you validate pattern here, the whole thing dies. You walk in the morning and none of them have loaded up over the night, right? It's tasked on a scheduled task. Somebody fat fingers with phone numbers in.
Are you passing that in through pipeline or through command line binding?
whatever it is, I mean, the idea is that it gets to the parameter and you check the validate script and validate value, and if it doesn't match on any of those 30 parameters you passed in, it just fails. So then I go through, well, maybe you should accept all 30 and then check logic in your script and say, well, give me all 30, then one of them fails. Let's go ahead and create the 29 that work. And then I create an error log at the end saying this one did work. So I watch in the morning and 29 worked, but one failed, versus this just crashes and the whole thing barfs at you.
Right. Because I can see it failing if you try to pass everything in as an array through command line binding. I can see that failing. If you try to do it through pipeline, then it should be throwing one number at a time through and then actually processing that completely.
No, it won't process it. We did this in the lab. So I teach part 2 classes.
Right.
Like, hey, let's try this. And someone says, what did you bring in these values? And you're like, no, it dies right away.
Interesting.
Which it should, because I don't accept any values coming in that feed this. But I like your thought too. Is, well, what if I pass in 30 of them and one of them doesn't match?
Yeah.
I have to take the values and put them into the context and say, go load this stuff. But I say, well, I don't want a valid pattern. So it won't go through.
Interesting.
At least the test that we did, we did it and tested it and it died on us. And we're like, okay, I like the validate pattern and rejects values, but I'd probably write some code that says, give me everything and let me worry about the humans in my code so I can get most of my job done.
Right.
Those, I don't know, those are questions though, right?
No, it's something that you can play around with then.
Right.
Just figure out what's.
Typing it in, then yeah, I want those values to be paired out in front of you.
Yeah.
But now the question is, should I bark a bunch of red at you, or or write some code and say, well, in pretty red or highlighted yellow, this is the error that occurred because you gave me bad garbage, you human person, as opposed to the whole thing just barking and say, why's your code broken? You put in the wrong value. It doesn't say that. It just gives me a bunch of red. So I don't know.
Something to think about.
You like this?
I don't run into a lot of cases where I need to use it.
Okay.
Yeah, someone who works a little bit more in that area. Usually, if I'm pulling stuff input in like that, it's something I've either sanitized already or something I've created myself.
Right.
Generally, HR is not sending me a list of things to update, so I don't have to worry about it too much. Another attribute you can use is validate script. And this one's fun because you can throw an entire script block in there. And if that script block evaluates to true, great, your parameter binds. So in this case, we're just looking for digits of length 10. We're just looking for anything that'll take 10 digits. Yay, it works. If you take one out, it fails. So, if you're a little looser or different and, how you want phone numbers to appear in Active Directory or how they're input, then you can use different ways to validate that you do have a phone number based on whatever loose or strict standards you have on the matter.
Do the right error, I think, validate script.
Hey, which one?
Right error, error and validate script.
Oh, can you? Yeah, that actually, that would make sense.
So you could, in the case of the array, you could say there was an error on this item in the array.
Would be a good idea. Yeah.
Do you know if that works in the first item or every item?
I think it runs for once for every item in the pipeline or once for an array. I think.
So the example that we have in our class is someone hands me a list of dates and update the calendar. And so I need all dates greater than or equal to today. So why would I take someone's last, like January 1st is a holiday. So why would I put on my web page that I'm going to populate January 1st, 2019? And so what happens is you take these values and say, well, no, just give me everything, March, April, May, July, and so forth of all the holidays. Then if you run this, it just barks right away and says, fail, because you have one instance of that array that dies. And that's where I say, well, I'd rather have all of the valid dates.
Yeah.
And just, so go back and forth. I love this option, but at the same time, it's just, it works up right away before I can do anything. So,
Probably a way around it, something worth playing with.
yeah.
Hey.
otherwise they accept the bad along with it, and put in something else, quantify that.
Well, that's-
as far as what element it is. And,
Right,
yeah,
but that's after this parameter.
Okay,
line
yeah,
kicks in, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
Right, and I actually love the thought, that's what I'd rather do, just give me all the garbage, because I can sanitize it.
I have that in mind, and I just,
Yeah.
I continue on, and right now I'm lacking the word, and all that comes to my mind.
Right, continue on, set that bad stuff aside, but do the rest of the good stuff. But if you throw in this parameter here, it just barks on everything, and just says, I'm not continuing on with the next line at all, so.
It sounds like it's not the right place to evaluate that.
It's not, if you sanitize the data ahead of time, this works beautifully.
We're derailing the talk again.
So no worries.
But I like finding out what people do, you know, and how do they use this, if at all, because I babble about this stuff all the time, and I'm like, I don't know if anybody uses this.
I haven't run into a case where it's used. I'm sure if you do, you could probably do a search on GitHub for anything PowerShell language with validate script in it or validate pattern in it.
Right.
And you can probably find a lot of examples of people at least making an attempt.
I've used it to check to see which OS you're running on.
Oh.
See, like, oh, you can't, this parameter doesn't work on this OS.
Oh, get hotfix, for example, right?
But on the parameter level, so like,
Right.
in this case, it's starting web server, and SSL is only supported on Windows, so you throw an error in. On Linux.
Gotcha. That sounds like that could be a good use case for dynamic parameters, which I haven't played with, but yeah, but parameters that are dynamic based on whatever code you stick in there. So you could probably have something to check the OS for you.
When does that run? I wonder. Like when you import the module, maybe?
I'm not entirely sure. It's not something I've looked at a whole lot, and as far as I understand it, that's a pretty big rabbit hole to get lost in.
Yeah.
Depends on the provider you're in.
Yeah,
Query the provider, and you have to write a lot of logic to say, yeah, if OS is this, then do this. I would go to the other parameter switch of dynamic parameter.
yeah.
You can create a select case like you did with the switch and say, if this, go this here, and then present these parameter values based on that. So I could say, yeah, BIOS or OS or 2008 R2 parameter, which is 2012 parameter. Or something.
Yeah.
It's a lot of code. It's 10 lines as opposed to it's simple. This is much easier.
It is, and this stuff even gets pretty deep if you go into it. You could have a advanced parameters functions course. Another pretty handy, forgive me. Another pretty handy use of the validate script is you can throw a test path in there on a path variable, rather than checking, you know, if test path, whatever, exit, you know, else exit. I may not have that path in here anymore. C works. But yeah, you can use that to quickly check a path if you're taking that as input anywhere. This one I had no idea about before a couple weeks ago. Validate drive. If you, for whatever reason, need to validate that a path, you don't need to validate the path exists. You just need to validate that it's pointing to a drive that you put in this list. You can do that.
I wonder if that's new to like 5.1.
I'm not sure. I didn't bother checking the version. But so like the C apps folder that just failed on me will now succeed because I told it C. I move it to it.
Provider. What if you had?
You can do it for providers. PS drives, rather. So yeah, you can stick the function drive in there if you want to. HKLM, I think, is mapped by default as PS drive. You can throw that in there if you want to. And it won't validate that the keys or the individual functions that you're looking for exist, but as long as you're in the drive, That's all it cares about.
Well, you can use this for a provider, for like SQL or
You could.
it's a PS Drive.
Yeah.
You know, that's pretty cool.
So, last little thing that none of us ever do nearly as much as we should, but we should. Comment-based help is wonderful, and you'll probably find all kinds of examples about where to stick these things. I'm a big fan of sticking it right above commandlet binding at the top of your function body. And what this will do, it'll do absolutely nothing for the function of your function, obviously, but this is where you start populating the information that can be found in GitHelp. So throw stuff in here. And there's a good number of these sections that you can put in there. But these are probably the most common that I would use, and that's even being generous for inputs, outputs, and notes. Synopsis, description, parameter, and example are probably ones that you definitely want to use if you want to have your function well documented. Yeah, you can put a link in there too to outside documentation that you think is useful in context. You can do a link to other commandlets and functions that are, you know, like you look at the documentation on some of them and they'll say like, you know, related items, and there'll be a list of other commandlets that are kind of in the same ballpark. I think they specify that with the links section as well. More detailed info, the parameter heading, you specify one of these for every single parameter in your function. That's a bit verbose. So for the sake of being already half hour over, we'll just say computer name. You can specify an example, which is, I mean, this is really just all text-based stuff.
Feels like it's case sensitive, but it's not.
The headers?
Yeah.
I don't know that I've tried it.
So do you have ISE? Do you have ISE in there?
Probably. I don't run that anymore though, so I couldn't tell you.
Oh,
I don't even look for it.
If you launch it real quick, I'll show
I do have it. Look at that.
you. And then Control J starts snippets. And you
Oh.
advanced function complete. It actually lists them all out. So it doesn't like me understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now synopsis, this annoys me to no end, but the synopsis is not case sensitive and all the rest are, and they won't go fix this. I'm like,
Oh, is it really? Okay.
dude, what about consistency? Why do you want to be consistent, right? But
Yeah, there is a similar snippet in VS Code. Was it Control-Shift-J? No, Control-Alt-J. Control-Alt-J to pull up the VS Code snippets and comment help. And that's all it gives you. There's a lot more, but that's, aside from the parameters heading, that's generally good enough. You can make your own snippet on that as well, though, for whichever ones you'd like to use frequently. And once that's in, our synopsis shows up in there. Our description shows up in there for that one. We do full. We can start to get more information. So this information is populated automatically from the metadata that's in the function. This section that we actually wrote up here for the parameter, this text just gets thrown right at the top of that information, just to give a little more contextual information about that parameter if you want to. But filling that out it can be tedious, but someone who's going to be using it will probably thank you.
It should be required.
It probably should be, because I am actually a huge fan of man example, just to see what are the different ways that I could or should be using whatever this thing is that I just got. If it lacks examples, that just irks me to no end.
And you can actually type below the example and then give you all that code also.
Yeah, you can put in as many of these example headings as you want.
And it'll automatically number it for you. That's really simple too.
Yeah. You just do more stuff. You can go on and on and on and on and on. As many examples as you want. And right underneath that heading until the next heading, whatever text you want, however you want to format your examples. It'll work just fine for all of that. And I'd say arguably that's probably the most useful thing that you can do in comment-based help. So that is about all I had for you gentlemen and lady. Any questions from anyone that we didn't go over as we were going through everything? Yeah, when I said you would need a advanced functions demo.
For risk mitigation.
The risk mitigation parameters, I looked a little bit at those, should process and what if. I'm not familiar enough with them to throw them in there. I was kind of getting to the point, even at this, yeah, going an hour and a half. Yeah, it started getting to the point where it's like, some of these edge cases, they're interesting, but I should probably cut them out for the sake of not being here for 3 hours, because if you want to dig into everything you could do with advanced functions, you could be here all night.
Oh yeah.
There's tons of stuff. Yeah, but I wanted to at least try to hit the high points that are probably most commonly useful. Yeah, there's a ton of stuff there. There's even, I found out, there is a supports paging attribute for the commandlet binding attribute. So where you can specify, yeah, I've got my result set, and you want to give the user the option to skip the first 5, or give me only, between number 100 and 200.
Or if you query a 20,000 object thing, you write code to say, give me the first 1,000, and you set those aside. Now, what about the next 1,000, and so on?
Yeah, you can do some pretty wild stuff with some of them.
And then the help URI, throw that in.
I forgot about that one.
Yeah. Another example is, I think there's a part 2 coming for this. So you can throw in like a URI of like where the help documentation is, or like an internal wiki page. Right, so.
Or just send them to Google. Don't do that.
It actually has to be HTTP in front of it.
Oh, do you have to have fully formatted?
You have to have it.
So like that?
Yeah.
And you could probably even append a query string at the end of this?
Yeah. Well, I feel part 2.
So if we did a man get demo computer info. Yeah, so where that help URI comes in is if you specify man or get help and then the online switch, it'll open a browser to whatever URL you stuck in there for getting to your help documentation.
Once you get if you have an internal wiki that you document and where it came from and what it used before you go on, it's coded there, not in the function, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of useful information.
Hope you learned something. Maybe. I thought I had a lot of free time this month to work on it. That ended up not being the case. But
What do you got for extension? What's the bars on the left there beside the line number?
oh, and my shell?